Coming up, the Secretary of Education sits down with ICT to talk about what he learned from Native students. Plus, the UN Forum on Indigenous Issues starts today, and the Eastern Medicine Singers highlight the Algonquin language. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Thank you for joining us. We began on the West Coast, where action by the federal government is restoring authority to California tribes to govern and manage the leasing of their lands. Last week, the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs said land leasing regulations have been approved for 5 federally recognized tribes. This action restores tribal authority over Indian trust and restricted fee lands. This means the leases no longer need a review from the Interior Secretary. Indian Affairs Assistant Secretary Brian Newland spoke about encouraging more nations to begin this process, saying, in part, "We will continue to welcome tribes to submit Hearth Act leasing ordinances and reclaim the authority to manage the development of their homelands." To date, 77 tribal nations have now received secretarial approval for their leasing regulations, with 8 others awaiting action. In the state of Washington, disenrolled Nooksack citizens are continuing to fight to stay in their homes. The United Nations sent a letter in February asking the U.S. to intervene. An investigation by the Interior Department found there were no tribal housing policy or due process violations. Now, 7 disenrolled citizens are filing a lawsuit in an effort to stay in their homes. The tribe contends those facing evictions are no longer citizens and therefore no longer eligible for tribal services like housing. To date, the nation has disenrolled more than 306 citizens, which began during a 2018 political dispute. And in recent months, the tribe has moved to evict up to 63 former citizens from its tribal housing. For more information on this story, visit our website at IndianCountryToday.com. Just search for the title, "Disenrolled Nooksack Citizens Continue to Fight to Stay in Their Homes." Step into the world of someone who is disabled. That is the challenge presented at the 18th Annual American Indian Disability Summit held in Phoenix earlier this month. ICT's Patty Tholahongba reports.
According to a report by the Arizona Indian Education, around 16% of Native American students, K through 12, are classified as students with a disability, compared to 13% of students from other ethnicities. Gerald Joseph was the keynote speaker, and he's an expert in special education.
In indigenous communities, you will find oftentimes that we don't have a term for disability, right? Disability is a Western construct.
So he never looked at his brother as being disabled, yet his brother was deaf. He was sent 340 miles away to a boarding school for the deaf because the Hopi tribe didn't have the educational services to teach someone who is deaf. Joseph says it was the same as when the government took Native children from their homes and sent them to boarding schools. His brother was removed from his family, his clan, and his community.
Bubba says he remembers covering his head with a pillow because the crying wouldn't stop.
The conference theme, Gathering Native Voices to Build Strength Through Unity, is what this group is trying to build. Rosalie Perry says she's lucky. Her tribal community has paved sidewalks and well-lit roads. She drives her own car and is able to be independent.
But for people with disabilities and others that have difficulties with transportation, This is a real issue, especially in other tribal lands.
There are success stories. Through the years, youth have attended this summit and now return as adults.
They're actually working. They have leadership skills developed through some of the programs and the resources that we have here in this room today. They have jobs. They have families.
Still, they all agree that tribes must address the needs of the disabled community as they look at tribal nation building. In Tempe, Arizona, Patty Tolahungva, ICT News.
A key organization is introducing its fourth year of partnerships with female cultural leaders. Spirit Aligned Leadership's annual Indigenous Knowledge Sharing Program pairs elders and young women together. The duo then carry out projects to preserve culture together. This is the only Indigenous women-led organization in the United States and Canada focused solely on a Native women exchanging knowledge program. So far, the organization has partnered with 57 Indigenous women to take part. Gail Small, the program director, spoke to ICT about why these knowledge exchanges are so important to her.
This is something I really wanted to focus upon, get away from all the legal wrangling and fighting that, my career has been, my serving on tribal council, and look at a higher level of knowledge sharing. But it has to be intentional, and it has to be something that is desired.
For a full list of this year's participants and their projects, visit Spirit Aligned Leadership's website. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, the Algonquin language gets attention in a new album, and what's on the table at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. But first, he advises President Biden on all things education. We hear from Secretary Miguel Cardona. Stay with us. It's not every day that a cabinet secretary travels to tribal lands. That was the case last week when U.S. Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona traveled to New Mexico. There, he met with students at the Santa Fe Indian School, and he traveled to Jemez Pueblo. The Education Secretary sat down with ICT after his visit, saying his message to students and educators was simple, that their voices are important.
We could talk about policy all day in D.C., but when you talk to students and when you talk to educators and when you see it firsthand, it just really reminds us of how important it is to hear from students and to listen to their perspective on how they're coming back from the pandemic and what their needs are. What I heard loud and clear from these high school students was the importance and the need for mental health supports. Each student shared examples of how their lives have changed over the last 2 years. And almost every student said that the emotional recovery is something that they're more focused on right now than the academic recovery. So that's from the mouth of students. They said, I'll learn better when I feel better. And so then I saw down the hall, I saw a public-private partnership where we have mental health experts and behavioral health experts who are partnering with the school. So it's a private Presbyterian mental health services. They're set up in the school, so there's a good partnership there, so that our school counselors could support our students with school-related topics, and our the counselors that are connected to the schools can help with other more deeper or more family-based issues. But it was a great network here of support for students. And then the last thing I'll share is I visited a program where high school students, student governance leaders were putting together a food drive, because so many families post-pandemic, because this is a tourist economy, so many families were left without work, without income, and students are leading this effort to make sure that food insecurity is addressed. So I'm inspired by these students. I heard them, they need more, and I'm thankful that the American Rescue Plan is there to provide some of the funds that they need to get these programs in place.
Santa Fe Indian School students told Cardona the struggles they faced during the pandemic.
I spoke to a student a couple hours ago who told me his mother died during the pandemic. I spoke to another student who said a good friend of his was murdered during the pandemic. And these students are, their support comes from programs within the schools. And, when we talk about the American Rescue Plan and we talk about social emotional well-being, it includes support for students who are having ideation. As a matter of fact, one of the directors of the community-based program that's housed in the school talked a lot about suicide prevention and about how this team that's set up, and they have offices in Santa Fe High School, they can respond to students within an hour if any concerns are brought up. So, typically you think, well, a parent will take a child to a and they'll make an appointment and they'll try to get seen soon. Within an hour, the students at Santa Fe High School have access to a mental health professional if they have ideations. And that's what's possible with the American Rescue Plan. That's what's possible when we reimagine education and think of social emotional well-being as much as we think of academic success.
Cardona says he believes traditional values can help keep children safe.
It reminds me a lot of conversations I've had with Native Americans who they've understood forever that you need to start with it's the whole child, that we need to think of mind, body, spirit, everything. And that's what I heard today from our students.
Another important topic for Cardona is technology, especially in rural America.
When the pandemic first hit in March 2020, I was in Connecticut at the time, and the first thing we tried to address was food insecurity, right? Then broadband access, and we found that it was not equitable. If anything, what we found during the pandemic, that broadband access or lack of access, especially for our rural communities, made opportunity gaps wider, made achievement gaps wider, lack of access wider. So it's been a very, very pointed focus of our president, and I'm proud of that. The bipartisan infrastructure plan is going to make it so that the broadband access issues are in our rearview mirror. I'm really excited about the fact that finally we have a president that said we're gonna close this digital divide. So the infrastructure plan has that, but also through the American Rescue Plan funds. I've talked to countless superintendents, and especially in rural communities, who've said we're going to get devices in the hands of our kids. We're going to improve broadband access, and the infrastructure plan is going to make it better. But we're not going to wait. We're going to keep doing what we need to do to make sure all students have access to online resources. The computer and broadband access is the new pencil. It's not a luxury. It's what students need to be successful, and every student deserves it.
Student debt is a concern that got worse for many during the pandemic.
As a first-generation college student, myself and a parent of 2 high schoolers who are going to college, it does matter to me a lot. It seems to me that this system has been broken for so long, and we're working really hard at the Department of Education to fix it. In the first year, we revamped public service loan forgiveness, which means more than 700,000 Americans are getting emails saying you're closer to debt relief than ever before. Over $17 billion in loan forgiveness has been done. And our underserved communities have been impacted by a broken system the most. So it's really important for me to fix the system that's broken, to make sure we're caring for our borrowers who are first generation or who maybe don't have a lot of resources. College should be available to everyone. It should be affordable, and we're working really hard to make that happen.
And we'll be right back. The music by the Eastern Medicine Singers combines traditional powwow music with other elements. That includes psychedelic punk, spiritual jazz, and electronics in a stunning blend. And much of their music is in the Massachusetts dialect of the Eastern Algonquin language. Joining us is the band leader, Daryl Black Eagle Jameson. But first, let's take a listen. Daryl, welcome to the ICT Newscast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just start off. Tell us about your music.
There's so much to tell. I mean, our music is it's a combination of Eastern style music, which is different than Western and Southern. It's a kind of like a spiritual type, but it's also a powwow. We do a lot of the powwows in the East, and our music is based off of the old words of the Eastern Algonquin dialect, and it's very spiritual on one end, and of course on the other end we have a lot of the traditional type music, dances and things that we do at the powwows throughout the East and around the country. And we also do a lot of different productions with the state and other individuals that want to just hear that type of music from the old days. So it's great.
When we're talking about language preservation, where did that conversation start for your group? Was that something that you all wanted to do from the beginning?
Yes, it was actually based from one of the elders that started teaching me the language years ago. His name was Clint Wixon, and he passed, and he asked me to promise him that I would continue with the amount of language that I learned. And I decided after some time that maybe doing it through drumming and the repetition of bringing those songs back would help people to understand the language, to hear the sounds of the language, and that would continue to fuel people to be out there and to grab onto that Eastern culture and tradition and do it. So it's been very successful for us.
What have been some of the stories that you've heard? Because I imagine people from all walks of life are hearing this language and probably all have a reaction to it. But what are some of the stories that you can share about that?
Well, one of the most interesting stories was we were doing a powwow up on Long Island for the Matinecock tribe. And we had a Jewish rabbi that came by when we were doing one of the songs that's actually on the album Sunset. And he was crying, and he said that word, it comes from an ancient name of the creator in our language, and he just couldn't figure out where it came from. And he was just mesmerized by the song. And that was like one of the best feelings that I ever had, because that's one of the old songs that was passed down through Adi Red Medicine of the Shinnecock Nation.
That is so wonderful. And talking about your music to come, I want to talk about this collaboration with Stone Tapes. Tell us about that.
So Stone Tapes is Jonathan Gatt, and he, produced this with me as well. And he has just started, this is a new label, and he's doing a lot of interesting things with different world musicians and native groups and from all over the world. And Oz was pretty much the first one that he's ever done. And it was an interesting, collaboration, because it was just meant to happen. We met him in 2017 at South by Southwest on a project that we were doing, bringing Rhode Island musicians down to Austin. And our brother, Raymond Two Hawks, had written a grant and brought us all down there. And he came and was listening to our music and was just mesmerized. He just kept watching it. And then finally, he approached Raymond Two Hawks and asked him if we'd be interested in playing with him. And, Two Hawks asked me, and at first I was kind of like, oh, rock and roll, I don't know. We're kind of traditional, and he said, let's just give it a try. It's something new. So we went in and we played at the Spider House Cafe with him inside. We played this one song. It was magical. And I was like, okay, I don't know if they liked it. Let's get off the stage. So we ran out with the drum and he came running back, grabbed us, and I guess people loved it. They were screaming. Some people were crying. It was just so unique. And that blend of that music just continued. He said, we have to stay together. So we continued working together and doing music. And we ended up doing our first video, which we did up in Vermont at Quechee Gorge, where we filmed. We're outside in the snow and the cold, And we filmed this one video. It was an amazing video. We were in, natural skins and everything. And that video really shot us off because we combined a lot of different songs in it. It was kind of like a medley of different Eastern songs. And I mean, just, wow, it took off. And then we just started playing all over the place after that together. And it's been a wonderful journey, and the amazing musicians that are with us. And Jonathan is, he's amazing. And he's got our best interest at heart. That's the main thing.
There are so many great stories to tell. Daryl, thank you so much for visiting with us today.
You're welcome.
The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues begins today. Its theme is Indigenous Peoples, Businesses, Autonomy, and the Human Rights Principles of Due Diligence, including free, prior, and informed consent. ICT's Karina Dominguez is in New York for the forum and will provide daily coverage at IndianCountryToday.com. Today, we're joined by Joseph Lee. He is the Indigenous Affairs Fellow at GRIST and is based in New York City. He will be covering the forum alongside Karina. Welcome, Joseph.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's just start off at a very high level. What is this forum and how does it work?
So the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is one of three agencies that the United Nations has to sort of oversee and make decisions and make recommendations based on Indigenous issues around the world. And this particular forum meets once a year here in New York, and it's made up of 16 Indigenous representatives from all around the world. And what they do is they come here and they convene and they have presentations and studies and they discuss, ongoing issues Indigenous people are facing around the world. And then they make recommendations to other UN bodies and they advocate for those recommendations that they make.
And these Indigenous leaders, they come from all over the world. Tell us who's there this time.
So the forum, like I said, is made up of these 16 forum members, and they come from the 7 Indigenous areas that the United Nations has represented. So we have 4 members from the United States. We have Jeffrey Roth, who is a Standing Rock Sioux descendant, and he's here representing the forum. We have members from various countries in Europe. We have members from Africa, from South America, Central America. So, the full spectrum of Indigenous people around the world.
And what do you think will be the major topics? I know that there's a theme of this forum, but what do you think will be the major talking points at this event?
There are a couple things. One of them is that the United Nations has announced the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And so I think that's going to be a really important thing. Obviously, Indigenous languages are very important to Indigenous communities, culture, and traditions. And around the world, they're under threat. Experts have recommended or have estimated that as many as 90% could be extinct or seriously limited by the end of the century if we don't take serious action. So I think that's going to be one topic that's going to be a big highlight. And another one, like you mentioned in the theme, is the idea of free, prior, informed consent, which is a really important part of international law that gives Indigenous people the ability to make decisions for themselves, to decide what happens on their own lands and to their communities, that we haven't really seen a high level of enforcement and application of that concept around the world.
Last year's forum, of course, included stronger protections for human rights for countries all across the country. Do you have any updates on sort of what the traction has been for that?
So one of the things that will happen this week is we are going to hear reports based on some of the things that were discussed at last year's forum. So today's the first day, so we haven't fully gotten into the flow of kind of hearing, what people are bringing back. But that's definitely something we're looking forward to hearing about is, these people went back to their home communities, conducted studies, did research, did interviews, and now they're going to share their findings based on some of those human rights issues that came up at last year's event.
That is so important. And of course, we're also coming off the heels of, the huge climate change summit that happened earlier this year. How much do you think that will be a conversation in this year's forum?
I think climate change is a huge part of it. And, climate change and environmental issues are kind of at the heart of everything that Indigenous people are facing around the world. And so I think it's definitely going to be a really, really important part of the conversation, especially in regards to things like extractive industries, potentially harmful conservation policies, because in the background is, there are international goals towards sustainable development, conservation, and these kinds of things. And so I think that what Indigenous people want to do is let their voices be heard and, kind of hopefully see the rest of the world acknowledge that they can be leaders in this area.
Well, Joseph, as I mentioned, our viewers can follow your reporting and our correspondent, ICT's Karina Dominguez, online at our website at IndianCountryToday.com. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.